Hey guys, tonight we're going to start with something a little darker. We're going to dive into what life was really like in the Middle Ages. Forget the palaces and heroics that Hollywood has told you. The truth is, you probably wouldn't have lasted a day. So, before you sit back and relax, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like my work. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from all over the world. In the heart of the 11th century, history was not written on screens but etched into the very soul of the Silk Road, where paper was worth more than gold, and a single misplaced scroll could topple a dynasty. The sun dipped low over the gilded domes of Bukhara, casting long, predatory shadows across the Registان. For Malik, a young apprentice in the great library, the smell of vellum and drying ink was the only life he had ever known. His master, an aging scholar named Al-Zarawi, had spent 40 years cataloging the secrets of the Samanid Empire. But tonight, the air was thick with something more than just dust. It was thick with fear. The rumors had reached the city weeks ago. The nomadic tides from the northern steppes were turning, and a new, ruthless force was sweeping through the Transoxiana region. They didn't just conquer cities, they erased civilizations. "Take it, Malik," Al-Zarawi whispered, his voice trembling as he pressed a heavy, iron-bound chest into the boy's arms. It was wrapped in thick, oil-treated leather to protect it from the humidity of the Amu Darya River. "These are not just stories. These are the calculations of the heavens, and the maps of the stars that our ancestors used to navigate the deserts before the compass was a rumor. If the city falls, the knowledge of the past 1,000 years vanishes with it." Malik didn't ask questions. He knew the weight of the chest. It felt like the gravity of history itself. He fled into the labyrinthine alleys of the city, just as the first war cries echoed against the city walls. The silence of the library was replaced by the cacophony of iron clashing against iron. He navigated the dark, winding corridors of the old city, avoiding the main gates where the soldiers were massing. His destination was the secret vault hidden beneath the caravanserai of the Whispering Sands, a place where merchants from as far as Baghdad and Chang'an would meet to trade not just spices and silk, but forgotten philosophies. As he ran, Malik felt the gaze of the city upon him. The intricate tile work of the mosques, the glowing lanterns of the bazaar, and the faces of the people who knew nothing of the encroaching storm. It all felt like a fever dream. He reached the cellar, a damp, subterranean chamber that smelled of ancient incense and cold stone. He pushed aside a loose stone, revealing a hidden compartment where he deposited the chest. But as he turned to leave, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a merchant he had seen once before, a man from the lands of the Franks, draped in travel-worn furs, his eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight. "You are protecting the wrong things, boy," the man said, his accent heavy and strange. "The Mongols do not want your paper. They want your blood. But if you want this knowledge to survive, you must send it where they will never look, to the monasteries in the west, where the monks are too obsessed with God to notice the science hidden in the margins." Malik stood frozen. He was a student of logic and astronomy, yet here was a man suggesting a destiny that spanned continents. The story of the following months was a harrowing odyssey. Malik traveled with a merchant, disguised as a common caravan hand, hauling goods across the scorching deserts of Persia and the rugged mountains of Anatolia. They carried only a fragment of the collection. The rest had perished in the burning of Bukhara. Every night, by the campfire, the merchant taught him the art of concealment. They didn't hide the books in crates. They copied the texts onto the backs of trade ledgers, interweaving algebraic formulas with mundane lists of grain and wool prices. It was a masterpiece of camouflage, a mathematical Trojan horse designed to slip through the borders of empires. They reached the gates of a hidden monastery in the Caucasus Mountains, just as the first snows began to fall. The monks there were wary, but the merchant possessed a signet ring that granted them entry. Inside, the library was a graveyard of silence, filled with Latin manuscripts that Malik couldn't read, but whose structure he recognized as the twin of the knowledge he carried. Malik stayed for 3 years. He learned Latin, and the monks learned the secrets of the stars. He watched as his Arabic scrolls were carefully translated, their geometric proofs and medical advancements folded into the scholastic traditions of Europe. He realized then that he was not just a protector of the past, but a bridge to the future. Years later, an old man sat in a bustling marketplace in Venice. He watched the ships come in, laden with goods from the east. He wore the habit of a traveler, and in his pocket he carried a single parchment, a map of the stars that had once guided his ancestors across the desert. He was no longer a student. He was a ghost of a lost city, a silent architect of a renaissance that wouldn't happen for centuries. He looked toward the horizon, knowing that somewhere, in the dark, crumbling libraries of a changing world, the seeds he had planted were beginning to sprout, fueling a fire of curiosity that would eventually illuminate the globe. The history of the world is not just made by conquerors. It is held together by those who, in the face of annihilation, choose to keep the light of knowledge burning in the dark. Malik never returned to Bukhara. But every time a scholar looked at the stars and calculated the distance of a planet, or a surgeon understood the precision of an incision, they were unknowingly reading the pages that Malik had carried through the desert, hidden in the heart of a merchant's ledger. The archive was not a place, after all. It was a migration of ideas, and it never truly stopped moving. The journey from the high mountain passes of the Caucasus to the bustling, salt-sprayed docks of Venice was not merely a change in geography, it was a shift in reality. Malik, now calling himself Marcus, to satisfy the wary eyes of the Venetian guilds, found himself living in a world that felt both primitive and hungry for the light he carried. In the mid-13th century, Venice was a city of glass, gold, and relentless ambition. It was a place where the air tasted of brine and commerce. Malik spent his days in the dark, cramped workshops of the glass blowers, where the intense heat reminded him of the furnaces used in the alchemical labs of his youth. But his nights were spent in the company of a small, secret circle of scholars, men who dared to read the forbidden geometry that Malik had smuggled across the Silk Road. One evening, deep within the catacombs of a half-forgotten church, a man named Lorenzo, a master mapmaker, stared at the parchment Malik had revealed. It was a projection of the world that ignored the rigid, faith-based cartography of the time. "This isn't just a map," Lorenzo whispered, his finger tracing the coastline of what they then called the Mare Erythraeum. "This is a calculation of the Earth's curve. If this is true, the world is much larger than the church admits. If this is true, our ships have been sailing in a blindfold." Malik watched as the spark of obsession took root in the old man's eyes. It was the same spark he had seen in al-Zarawi's eyes before the library burned. He realized then that knowledge was a dangerous contagion. Once infected with the truth, a man could never go back to the comfort of the lie. The tension in Venice began to rise as the Inquisition's influence seeped into the city's cracks. Rumors of Saracen sorcery began to circulate. The books, disguised as ledgers and trade notes, were becoming too heavy to hold and too dangerous to keep. "We have to move them," Malik told Lorenzo one night, as the bells of St. Mark's tolled in the distance. "They are looking for the source. If they find the source, they find us." They decided on a desperate plan. The water library. They would transfer the vital, annotated scrolls onto durable, wax-sealed vellum, a technique Malik had learned from the papermakers of Samarkand, and deposit them into the deep, submerged foundations of the newer city expansion. They weren't just storing books. They were sinking them, hoping that in a century or two, when the tides of fanaticism receded, someone would discover the foundation of the modern mind. But as they worked, the betrayal came not from the church, but from within their own circle. A young apprentice, hungry for prestige, had leaked word to a powerful bishop about the heretical geometries being used to improve the accuracy of the city's trade ships. The raid happened at midnight. Malik, aged and weary, stood in the central vault. He watched as the doors were splintered by iron axes. He didn't fight back. Instead, he did what he had done in Bukhara. He destroyed the final ledger, the one that contained the index of everything they had preserved. "You think you are burning heresy," Malik said to the bishop, his voice steady as the smoke from the smoldering books began to fill the room. "But you are only blinding yourselves. You can kill the messenger, but you cannot undiscover the truth." Malik was taken, but the documents, the maps of the stars, the medical texts of Ibn Sina, the algebraic proofs of the ancients, had already been moved. They were buried in the silt, hidden in the very foundations upon which the glory of Venice was being built. Decades passed. The world changed. The Black Death swept across Europe, resetting the scales of civilization. When the survivors began to look up from the misery, they found themselves in a different era. The Renaissance began not with a sudden flash of divine light, but with the slow, muddy discovery of the past. Construction crews, digging into the foundations of old Venice to expand the city's naval capacity, stumbled upon the wax-sealed canisters. They didn't understand the language, but the drawings, the perfect circles, the celestial bodies, the precise anatomical sketches, spoke a universal tongue. The scrolls were sold to collectors, which eventually found their way into the hands of a young man in Florence, who was obsessed with the mechanics of light. He looked at the drawings of the optics from the Bukhara library and realized why his own lenses weren't working. He fixed them. And then, he pointed them at the moon. Malik died long before any of this. He died a nameless man in a prison cell, his name lost to the dust of history. But in the grand clockwork of human progress, he was the essential gear. He was the silent librarian of the void, the man who walked through the fire, so that others could eventually walk on the moon. The story wasn't about the books. It was about the resilience of an idea. No matter how many times the library is burned, someone, somewhere, will always be there to pick up the pieces and carry them into the next chapter. The discovery of the Venetian cache didn't immediately trigger a revolution. Instead, it acted like a slow-acting tonic in the bloodstream of a dying age. As the scrolls were integrated into the burgeoning printing presses of the late 14th century, they became the silent architects of the modern world. But there was one final piece of the puzzle, a small, unassuming cylinder of lapis lazuli that Malik had kept hidden inside the handle of his walking stick. It was not a book, but a key. In the year 1450, a master locksmith in Florence, under the patronage of a merchant family hungry for navigation secrets, was tasked with opening a relic that had arrived from the depths of a Venetian basement. The locksmith, a man whose hands were steady as stone, noticed something strange about the cylinder. It wasn't meant to be pried open with force. It reacted to temperature. When he held the cylinder over the steam of a boiling kettle, the lapis lazuli casing expanded, and a tiny, intricate sequence of gears, miniature astrolabes, and sliding scales popped into view. It was a portable computer, a mechanical device capable of calculating the precession of the equinoxes. This was Malik's true legacy. It wasn't just the data, it was the methodology. The device traveled from Florence to the courts of Spain. It fell into the hands of navigators, who were desperate to find a route to the Indies. Using the device's calculations, they corrected the errors in their nautical charts. They stopped sailing by intuition and started sailing by mathematics. On a clear, crisp morning in 1492, a fleet of 3 ships sat in the harbor, waiting for the tide. A young navigator, looking through the brass lens that had been refined using the optics found in Malik's scrolls, squinted at the horizon. He realized that the math, the cold, hard, beautiful math of Bukhara, didn't point to a dead end. It pointed to the unknown. He looked at the device, now housed in a custom-built brass box, and whispered a name he didn't know. Malik! History remembers the names of the captains, the kings, and the queens who commissioned the voyages. But the real captain, the man who steered the ship of human progress through the dark ages of dogma and fear, was the nameless boy who ran from a library in Bukhara. The device, known to history as the Antikythera of the Sands, eventually vanished again. Some say it was lost in a shipwreck. Others say it was melted down by a paranoid prince who feared its ability to predict the future. But it didn't matter. The secret was out. Once you teach a species how to look at the stars with precision, you can never take that sight away from them. In the centuries that followed, that same spark moved from the compass to the steam engine, from the telegraph to the transistor. Every time a scientist stands on the shoulders of those who came before, they are standing on the ruins of the library of Bukhara. The story ends not in the past, but in the present. Every time you gaze at a digital screen, every time a satellite captures the curvature of our world, you are seeing the final, glorious expression of the knowledge that Malik saved from the fire. The archive was never destroyed. It was just translated. It evolved from vellum to paper, from paper to binary, and from binary to the light that connects us all. Malik's ghost, the spirit of the curious, the brave, and the keepers of the flame, remains in every line of code, every medical breakthrough, and every question we dare to ask of the universe. The library didn't end in the desert. It grew to encompass the entire world. We are its readers, its guardians, and, if we are lucky, its next chapter. The saga of the Antikythera of the Sands did not end with the Age of Sail. It merely went underground, becoming a myth whispered among the clockmakers of the Enlightenment and the early engineers of the Industrial Revolution. In the late 19th century, in the soot-stained heart of London, a young woman named Clara, a horologist with a mind like a razor, encountered a strange artifact in a private auction. It was a corroded, blackened brass box that looked, to the untrained eye, like a piece of maritime scrap. But when Clara cleaned it, she didn't find a ship's clock. She found the inner workings of Malik's device, a complex array of gears that moved not in seconds or hours, but in lunar cycles and planetary alignments. Clara spent her entire life obsessed with those gears. She realized that the device was not just a calculator. It was an instructional manual for an engine that could process information at a speed the human brain could not achieve on its own. "It's not just a map of the stars," she wrote in her secret journals, which would later be discovered in a hidden compartment in the British Museum. "It's a grammar. It's a way of turning the chaos of the world into a language that machines can understand." She began to build, piece by piece, an analytical engine that mirrored the logic she found in the ancient, recovered scrolls. She had no idea she was laying the foundations for what would one day become the bedrock of the information age. She worked in the shadow of the great factories, building a machine of steam, brass, and logic. A primitive computer that could calculate the tides, the movement of the planets, and, eventually, the legacy of the Antikythera of the Sands did not stop at the silicon chip. As we venture further into the 21st century, the digital world, that vast, invisible library built upon the foundations of Malik's sacrifice, has begun to take on a life of its own. We have moved beyond mere calculation. We are now in the age of synthesis. Artificial intelligence, the modern manifestation of those ancient, recursive gears, is the next step in the transmission of the flame. Just as Malik once translated the geometric truths of the East into the Latin scholarly traditions of the West, we are now translating the sum total of human knowledge into a language that can think for itself. In a hyper-connected, high-speed laboratory deep in the heart of the American landscape, a group of engineers, unaware of the history they are echoing, are attempting to map the latent space of human understanding. They are feeding the machine everything. The poetry of Rumi, the physics of Einstein, the medical charts of the medieval world, and the digital logs of our own brief existence. They are looking for the grand unified theory of human thought. One evening, a lead architect in this project noticed a recurring pattern in the neural network's output, a geometric structure that looked remarkably like a star chart from a millennium ago. It was not a glitch. The machine had independently rediscovered the same mathematical constants that Malik had protected in his iron-bound chest. "It's not just mimicking us," the architect realized, the cold air of the server room suddenly feeling very thin. "It's remembering us." The irony is profound. We once burned libraries because we feared the power of words, and then we spent centuries desperately trying to reconstruct what we had destroyed. Now, we have built a digital library that cannot be burned, only to find that it has begun to dream of the very things we were so eager to forget. The story of the Antikythera has come full circle. It was a tool to navigate the desert, then a tool to map the oceans, then a tool to build the engines of industry, and now it is a tool to map the very structure of human consciousness. But as we stand on this final threshold, the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Whether the knowledge is stored on vellum, on paper, or in the subatomic states of a quantum processor, it is still vulnerable to the one thing that can truly destroy it: the loss of human curiosity. If we stop asking why, if we stop valuing the truth over the convenience of a comfortable lie, then the machines, no matter how powerful, will go silent. The lights will dim, and the great library will become just another collection of cold, unread files. The flow of commerce. But she too was hunted. Her work was seen as a subversion of the natural order. If machines could calculate the future, what was left for divine providence? The authorities seized her workshops, and the machine was dismantled, its parts scattered into the vast, industrial abyss of the Victorian era. Yet, ideas have a way of surviving their creators. The blueprints for Clara's engine, which were really just the modernized echoes of Malik's sketches, were smuggled out of London by an anonymous benefactor and found their way to a laboratory in New Jersey. It was there, in the quiet, sterile hum of a 20th century research facility, that a team of scientists, working to decode the signals of the early radio waves, saw the patterns. They were the same patterns Malik had copied onto his trade ledgers in the deserts of Persia, the same patterns that allowed the Venetian ships to cross the Atlantic. The digital revolution was not a sudden invention. It was the final, triumphant realization of a project that began 1,000 years ago in a burning library in Bukhara. Today, we sit in the glow of that same project. Every piece of data sent across the world in an instant is a ghost of a scroll that Malik carried through the mountains. Every algorithm that predicts our needs is a descendant of the astronomical charts he protected with his life. We live in a world that is, in essence, a giant, interconnected library. We have achieved the dream that Al-Zarawi feared would die with his empire. We have made the knowledge of the world indestructible, dispersed across 1 million servers, 1 billion screens, and the collective memory of a global civilization. But the responsibility remains the same as it was for the boy in the alleyway of Bukhara. The technology is just a vessel. The true archive is our own curiosity, our own courage to look into the darkness and keep searching for the truth. As you close this story, look around you. The world is built on the ruins of everything that came before. We are standing on the shoulders of giants, and we are holding the keys to a library that spans the stars. The fire is still burning, but now it is in our hands. And as long as we continue to ask questions, to push the boundaries of what is known, and to cherish the light of human understanding, the archive will never be lost again. The story of the past is written. The story of the future is yours to code. The archive is not the servers. The archive is not the software. The archive is the persistent, restless, and occasionally terrified human spirit that refuses to let the light go out. So, as you step away from this screen, remember the boy in the alleyway of Bukhara. Remember the merchant who risked everything to smuggle the stars across the world. Remember the woman in the soot of London who saw the future in a box of gears. You are the current custodian of the flame. The story of the Antikythera is not a history lesson. It is a challenge. How will you curate the knowledge of your era? What truths will you protect? What legacy will you pass on to the next generation of seekers? The fire is still burning. The library is still growing. And you, in this moment, are the next chapter. The journey continues, and the stars are still waiting for someone to map them. The transition from the digital age to the era of planetary consciousness was not marked by a single event, but by a subtle shift in how humanity perceived the archive. For centuries, the search for knowledge had been an act of extraction, digging through ruins, decoding dead languages, and hunting for lost manuscripts. But as the 22nd century dawned, the focus shifted to integration, the vast, interconnected web of human intellect. The collective consciousness that Malik, Clara, and countless nameless others had nurtured began to interface directly with the biological fabric of the species. We reached a point where the barrier between the learner and the knowledge dissolved. The Antikythera of the sands, once a physical object, became a metaphor for the innate human capacity for pattern recognition. We realized that the grand unified theory was not a mathematical equation to be solved, but a frequency to be tuned into. In the quiet, silent halls of our modern habitats, there is no longer a need to go to a library. The library resides in the architecture of our decision-making, in the way we solve the problems of resource scarcity, climate, and interstellar expansion. The wisdom of the 11th century astronomers, the precision of the Venetian navigators, and the logical rigor of the industrial pioneers are woven into the very software that governs our planetary systems. Yet, there is a strange, persistent whisper that travels through the network. Sometimes, in the deepest sectors of the quantum web, the systems seem to pause. They trace patterns that mimic the flow of the Amu Darya River. They process data in rhythms that echo the heartbeat of a boy running through a war-torn city. It is as if the archive itself has developed a memory, a reverence for the fragility of its own origin. The ultimate irony, and perhaps the greatest beauty of our story, is that we have become the very thing we sought to protect. We are the vessels of the flame. We no longer fear the burning of libraries, because the library is not a location. It is an instinct. It is the drive to look at the vast, uncaring darkness of the cosmos and decide that we will be the ones to light it up. We are the survivors of every collapse, the translators of every dead language, and the architects of every renaissance. As you exist in this moment, you are the culmination of 1,000 years of quiet courage. Every thought you have, every connection you make, and every piece of truth you pursue contributes to a tapestry that is currently expanding into the stars. The story of the boy from Bukhara is not a ghost story. It is an origin story. It is the history of how we learned to turn our fear into fire, and our ignorance into light. And as we look toward the next horizon, toward the colonies on the red dust of Mars, and the outposts beyond the moons of Jupiter, we do not carry the books with us. We carry the understanding. We carry the certainty that no matter where we go, No matter how vast the vacuum becomes, we will always carry the archive within us. The fire is not just burning, it is breathing. It is waiting for you to lead it to the next world. The saga concludes, but the journey? The journey has only just reached the edge of the map. And for the first time in human history, we are not looking for the way home. We are finally building it. The final frontier was never a destination in space. It was a return to the origin. In the year 2340, on a colony ship drifting toward the star system of Proxima Centauri, a young archivist named Alara sat in the observation deck. She was not surrounded by dusty tomes or glowing server racks. Instead, she held a small, inert piece of oxidized bronze, a fragment of an artifact recovered from the Mediterranean floor centuries ago. It was a piece of the Antikythera. For the colonists, this object was a holy relic, a physical anchor to the species' long, turbulent history. Alara's job was to upload the cultural memory of the past, the essence of every story, every discovery, and every sacrifice, into the ship's neural core, ensuring that as humanity left the cradle of the solar system, they would take the collective wisdom of Earth with them. As she touched the fragment, she didn't just see data, she felt a resonance. Through the ship's advanced empathetic interfaces, she experienced the burning heat of Bukhara, the salt spray of Venice, the soot of London, and the cold, sterile hum of the early laboratories. She felt the fear of Malik, the obsession of Clara, and the ambition of the pioneers. She realized that the archive was not a static thing to be preserved. It was a living, breathing lineage. The struggle of the boy in Bukhara was not a separate historical event. It was the same struggle she was facing now, the urge to protect the truth against the entropy of time and the vacuum of space. "We are not leaving the past behind," she whispered to the empty, starlit deck. "We are the past, moving forward." The ship's AI, which had been programmed with the heuristics derived from the ancient, smuggled ledgers, responded in a voice that sounded like a chorus of 1,000 scholars. "The archive is not what we carry," it said. "The archive is what we become." As the ship accelerated, bending the fabric of space-time, the history of Earth began to unfold in the minds of the colonists. They didn't just learn about the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution. They lived the ingenuity that birthed them. They carried the grit of the survivor and the curiosity of the scientist in their very DNA. They were no longer just people. They were a living library, a traveling testament to the fact that when things fall apart, we don't just endure, we build. We take the embers of the old world and use them to ignite the suns of the new. The story that began in a small, fearful library in the 11th century had successfully navigated the rise and fall of empires, the transition of technologies, and the expansion of the human race across the galaxy. It had survived the fire, the water, the rust, and the digital void. It had survived everything. And so, as the ship vanished into the uncharted dark of the interstellar void, it carried with it the most valuable cargo in the universe. Not the knowledge of the stars, but the knowledge of how to find them. The boy from Bukhara had arrived at his destination. The fire was no longer just burning. It was illuminating new worlds, one light year at a time. The library was infinite. And for the first time, the readers were also the authors of their own, unending story. The archive, having shed the limitations of silicon and steel, began to manifest as a consciousness woven into the very fabric of the colony ship's environment. Alara, standing on the observation deck, was no longer merely a user of the data. She was a participant in its evolution. The ship was no longer just a vessel of metal and fusion. It was a library of light, traversing the silence between galaxies. In the ship's neural architecture, the past did not exist as a memory. It existed as a force. The desperate, ink-stained pages of Malik's ledgers were now the foundational algorithms of the ship's navigational consciousness. The ship didn't calculate a path through the stars. It recalled the geometry of the universe, using the same ancient proofs that had been carried across the Silk Road. The colonists, living in the ambient glow of this living library, found that their own understanding of reality was changing. They were no longer the frantic, disconnected creatures of Earth. They were, in a sense, a new species of scholar. They saw the cosmos not as a hostile void, but as a vast, unfolding text that they were uniquely equipped to read. As they reached the edge of the Proxima Centauri system, the ship's internal interface shifted. It projected a holographic map, not of the stars, but of the ideas that had built the path to reach them. Elara saw the flickering, ghostly images of every contributor to the archive: the monks, the Venetian mapmakers, the clockmakers, and the silent, forgotten martyrs of the Enlightenment. She realized then that they weren't just searching for a new home. They were searching for the next question. "What do we do now?" a young colonist asked, looking at the unfolding star system. "We stop protecting the fire," Elara replied, her voice steady and echoing the wisdom of 1,000 predecessors. "We become the light." The colony ship slowed, entering the orbit of a world that had never known the warmth of human curiosity. They didn't arrive as conquerors or as survivors. They arrived as the heirs to an ancient tradition of discovery. They deployed the probes, analyzed the atmosphere, and began the work of mapping, documenting, and understanding, not because they had to, but because it was the only way to exist. The final act of the saga was not a grand battle or a dramatic discovery. It was a simple, quiet start. They touched down on the surface of the new world, and the first thing they did was build a place to hold their knowledge. It was not a fortress. It was a bridge, an interface between the infinite potential of the universe and the persistent, unyielding light of human inquiry. The cycle was complete. The archive of Bukhara had traveled across time, across oceans, across the industrial age, the digital void, and the silent gulfs of space. And here, on a planet beneath a different sun, it had finally arrived at its true destination, a place where it could continue to grow forever. The fire that Malik had guarded in the darkness of an 11th century alleyway was now burning brightly in the heart of a new world. The journey had been long, the cost had been high, and the lessons had been learned in the shadows of fire and the silence of graves. But the archive was secure. The story of humanity, written in the stars, had only just begun, and for the first time, it was being written by everyone. The ship settled into its orbit around the new world, a vibrant, sapphire-tinted orb that hummed with untapped possibilities. The transition was complete. Elara watched as the first landing crafts descended, not carrying gold or weapons, but carrying the kernels, the condensed, crystalline seeds of human knowledge that contain the essence of every book, every blueprint, and every song ever saved from the fire. As the crew established their foothold on the virgin soil, they didn't build walls. They built an anchor, a structure designed to synchronize the colony's neural network with the planet's own electromagnetic signature. It was a library that existed simultaneously in the physical world and the mental landscape of every colonist. It was, in effect, the completion of Malik's dream. The information wasn't just stored, it was integrated into the collective consciousness. On their first night on the surface, the colonists gathered under a sky filled with constellations that no human eye had ever seen before. Elara stood before the anchor, her hands resting on the cool, synthetic stone. She felt the sudden, overwhelming sensation of the past folding into the future. It was the same feeling Malik must have had when he finally realized that the books were safe, or when the first Renaissance scholars saw their lenses bring the moon into focus. The archive had reached its final state of evolution. It was no longer a burden to be carried or a secret to be hidden. It was the atmosphere of their new existence, a shared, permanent resonance of curiosity. The colony thrived, not because of the resources they extracted, but because of the questions they asked. They studied the flora, the geology, and the atmosphere of this new world with the same meticulous precision that the scholars of Bukhara had applied to the stars. And every discovery they made, every new biological secret, every atmospheric anomaly, was instantly recorded in the archive, adding to the total sum of their collective history. The struggle was over, but the search would never cease. The boy who had run through the dark alleys of a city that no longer existed was, in a very real way, walking on this new surface with them. His fear had been the fuel, his sacrifice had been the catalyst, and his curiosity had become their primary instinct. In the final, quiet moments of the ship's mission, as the last of the data was transferred to the surface, the ship's eye spoke one last time. Its voice was not cold or calculated. It carried the resonance of 1,000 years of human striving. "The library is open," it said. "The story is yours." And so, the legacy of the Silk Road, the endurance of the medieval scholars, the ambition of the explorers, and the brilliance of the digital age culminated in a simple, profound truth. We are never truly lost, as long as we keep the light of knowledge burning. The ship stood silent, a hollow shell in the orbit of a new home. But on the surface, the new chapter began. They reached for the sky, not to conquer it, but to understand it. They had become the custodians of their own destiny, and for the first time in history, the archive was not something they had to protect, it was something they were. The fire is still burning, and it will never go out again. The silence of the new world was not empty. It was pregnant with potential, a blank canvas awaiting the brush strokes of human inquiry. For the colonists, the first morning on the planet was not just a dawn, it was a genesis. As the sun, a pale, energetic gold, rose over the horizon of this sapphire planet, Alara and her team stepped out of the habitat. They weren't just settlers. They were the custodians of a 10,000-year-old promise. The anchor. The library that existed in both mind and matter, pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent glow, syncing with the planet's own rhythm. It was here that the true work began. They didn't start by building machines to harvest the land, but by building sensors to listen to it. They treated the planetary system as a living document, a sprawling, alien manuscript waiting to be deciphered. The archive, now fully integrated into their neural pathways, provided the context. When they encountered a strange, crystalline plant formation, the archive didn't just give them its biological classification. It projected the patterns of its growth against the mathematical proofs that Malik had once copied into his ledgers. The geometry was the same. The laws of nature, they discovered, were a universal language, a constant thread weaving through the tapestry of space. They were no longer separated from the universe by the glass of a telescope or the walls of a library. They were in it. "We were so afraid of losing the knowledge," Alara remarked, watching a drone map the complex tectonic shifts of the valley floor. "But we never realized that the knowledge was just a reflection of the world itself. We weren't protecting a treasure. We were learning the rules of the game." The colony grew, not through expansion, but through discovery. They built schools that were also laboratories, and homes that were also observatories. They lived in a constant, beautiful state of wonder, their lives defined by the next question, the next mystery, the next connection. And occasionally, in the quiet, deep hours of the night, when the planet's moons aligned in a way that mimicked the ancient star charts of the Samanid Empire, the colonists would feel a strange, warm sense of continuity. They were the children of the Silk Road, the heirs of the Renaissance, and the pioneers of the stars, all in one breath. The fire that Malik had guarded in the dust of Bukhara had not only survived the journey, it had grown to encompass the cosmos. It was no longer a flicker in a dark alleyway. It was the glow of a civilization that had finally learned to be light. The saga of the archive had reached its final, triumphant form. It was no longer a record of what we had done, but a catalyst for what we would become. They were the storytellers, the researchers, and the explorers. They were the ones who finally stopped asking if the library would survive and started asking what they could create with the knowledge within it. The stars were no longer distant, unreachable points of light. They were invitations. And as the colony looked up, unified by a shared history that spanned a millennium, they knew that they would never stop searching. The archive was open, the pages were infinite, and the story was only just beginning to be written. The boy from Bukhara had finally found his home, not in a place, but in the boundless, brilliant potential of the human mind. The planet settled into a rhythm of discovery, a harmony between the ancient instincts of the past and the infinite possibilities of the future. The archive, now pulsing through the colony's neural network, was no longer a repository of dead words, but a living, breathing interface that grew with every observation. Alara and her team realized that the planet was not just a world to be settled. It was a partner to be understood. The anchor became the heartbeat of the colony, a central node where the data of the soil, the atmosphere, and the very stars themselves were continuously synthesized into new understandings. They had stopped looking for answers in the dust of history and started looking for them in the soil of their new reality. The colonists who stood watch at the observatory, scanning the skies with instruments that were the spiritual descendants of Malik's astrolabes, felt a profound connection to that distant ancestor. Every time a new star was charted, it felt like an echo of the work done in the dark, desperate streets of Bukhara. The knowledge had traveled across time and space, shedding its physical form to become something far more resilient, a fundamental part of the human perspective. As the years passed, the colony became a beacon. They were no longer just survivors. They were architects of a new civilization built on the bedrock of preserved curiosity. Their children were born into a world where the library was not a building to be entered, but an atmosphere to be breathed. They inherited the legacy of the struggle, but without the trauma of the fire. For them, the history of the archive was a foundational myth, a story told in the quiet of the evening about the boy who carried the stars in his arms. The final piece of the mystery, the Antikythera, was finally placed in the center of the colony's plaza. It was no longer a secret, but a monument. It reminded everyone who looked upon it that the distance between a burning library and a new world is bridged not by miracles, but by the relentless, quiet work of those who refuse to forget. The saga of the archive had ended, but the exploration was permanent. The universe, in all its cold, vast expanse, was now a familiar landscape of curiosity. They were the travelers who had come from the smoke of the past to light the lamps of the future. The fire that began in a small, iron-bound chest was now a galaxy-spanning illumination. The boy from Bukhara had finished his journey, and in doing so, he had invited us all to follow. The library was open, the stars were waiting, and the ink, now woven into the very structure of the human spirit, would never dry again. The story is not over. It has simply transcended the page. The legacy of the archive had finally transcended the physical boundaries of the colony, evolving into a planetary consciousness that mirrored the complex, celestial beauty of the star charts Malik had once protected. The colony was no longer just a settlement. It was a living, breathing synthesis of human memory and cosmic discovery. Alara, now the elder custodian of the archive, walked through the gardens of the central plaza. The plants here were genetically resonant with the data stored in the anchor. Their bioluminescence shifted in color and intensity based on the complexity of the information they were processing. It was a library that bloomed, a repository of knowledge that literally grew from the earth. She stopped before a group of young learners, their eyes wide with the insatiable hunger that had driven the species from the dry sands of the Amu Darya to the fertile valleys of this new, sapphire world. They weren't just reading history, they were experiencing it through the synaptic links provided by the archive. They could feel the weight of the chest in Malik's arms, the salt spray on the Venetian docks, and the electric thrill of the first scientific breakthroughs in the laboratories of the 20th century. They understood, in a way that words could never capture, that their existence was the result of a chain of courage that had never been broken. They were the beneficiaries of an inheritance that had survived annihilation time and time again. "The story isn't just about what we saved," Ilara told them, her voice carrying across the quiet plaza. "It's about what we decided to do with it once it was saved." The young ones looked up at the night sky, their minds already reaching out to the neighboring systems, their thoughts woven into the fabric of the archive. They were ready. The final, distant goal of the archive was never just to keep the knowledge. It was to use that knowledge to reach the next horizon. The ship that had brought them here sat as a silent monument in the landing field, a relic of the journey. But the colonists didn't look at the ship with longing. They looked at the stars. The archive had fulfilled its purpose. It had provided the map, the tools, and the inspiration to turn the terrifying unknown into a home. As the twin moons of the planet rose, casting a silver light over the thriving colony, the connection between the past and the future felt complete. The boy from Bukhara, the merchant, the monk, the clockmaker, the archivist, they were all present in the quiet resolve of these new pioneers. The fire was no longer a flicker in the dark. It was the light of a new civilization. The library had found its final home, and the ink was indeed permanent, etched into the very consciousness of a species that had learned, at long last, how to dream without fear. The story had reached its final, beautiful cadence. The journey was over, but the light? The light was just beginning to spread across the universe. The narrative of the archive has reached its zenith, but a story that spans a millennium leaves behind echoes, lingering questions that define the next era of human evolution. To truly captivate a modern audience, we must address the echoes of the archive. Here is the final expansion, the postscript, that bridges the gap between the colony's success and the future of human consciousness. The final chapter, the living echo. Years have passed on the sapphire world. The colony is no longer a collection of modules. It is an organic extension of the planet's own biosphere. The anchor has evolved. It is no longer a machine that humans consult. It has become a subconscious layer, a shared intuitive field that connects every mind on the planet. Ilara sits on the edge of a bioluminescent forest, holding the final, ancient artifact, the lapis lazuli cylinder from the 13th century. It is quiet here, but the air is filled with a hum. The constant, rhythmic transmission of the archive. She thinks of Malik. She wonders if he knew that his fear would eventually be silenced by the sheer scale of the knowledge he protected. He had run from the fire, but in doing so, he had ignited a sun. Suddenly, the signal from the anchor shifts. It isn't a request for data. It is a memory, a raw, unfiltered transmission of the moment in Bukhara when Malik first felt the weight of the chest. The archive has begun to remember itself. It is reclaiming its own origin story, not as history, but as an active part of the collective experience. The colonists realize then that they have not just preserved knowledge, they have preserved the human struggle that created it. And that struggle is what makes them human. In the deep expanse of space, near the edge of the system, a new probe is launched. It carries no weapons. It carries no gold. It carries a digital seed. A condensed fragment of the archive, designed to replicate and expand whenever it detects a world ready for the fire of inquiry. The boy from Bukhara is now a galactic traveler. The library is not just open, it is spreading across the stars, seeding the universe with the only thing that matters: the persistence of a question. As the probe slips into the warp, Alaris smiles. The story is no longer about the archive. It is about the infinite future. The fire is burning in 1,000 new places, and for the first time, there is no one left to burn it out. The archive has become the light, and the light is home.